have some great questions for you. We'll start with the paper generated by ChatGPT.
Oh yeah.
So we usually think of writing as someone who has something to say, but with large language models producing text without a speaker behind it, what does that change about how we should think about authorship and meaning?
Yeah, it changes everything. The sort of dominant understanding, and when I say dominant understanding, I mean the understanding we've inherited in sort of the Western tradition, is that writing is a secondary representation of speech, and speech is a primary representation of thought. This idea goes way back to Aristotle. It's in Aristotle's De Interpretatione, where he says that speech is a sign of thought and writing is a sign of speech. So as a result of that, we usually, when we're reading a document, try to penetrate the surface of the writing to locate the thoughts that are behind the writing in the original intentions of the author. And that creates a kind of communications model of reading that we're trying to understand what was in the mind of the author through the instrumentality of the writing. And this has functioned not only as a sort of colloquial understanding of how writing operates, but also within the traditions of literary theory and literary criticism. When you read something, one of the questions you often ask is, what is the author trying to say here? And that points out the way that we sort of internalize this way of thinking. Um, People who've worked in literary theory in the sort of 20th century sort of complicated this way of thinking about the role of the author. One of those being Roland Barthes, who said that writing stands on its own and it is therefore cut off from the authority of its author. And that empowers the reader to do all kinds of interpretive kinds of effort with regards to the text that is not necessarily trying to figure out the hidden intentions of the author. Derrida takes it even further in his critique of logocentrism and says that this way of thinking about language and writing is not only sort of endemic to the Western tradition, but it has given us a certain way in which we privilege speech over writing. And I think what we're seeing right now with large language models is the resurgence of a writing that happens without speaking. So that large language models don't have intention. They have no ideas in their head. They have no head. All they do is create
Right.
text. And so they are pulling apart this Aristotelian tradition that has connected writing through speech to thought. And that, for a lot of us, is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to think about writing in new ways that sort of track what was developed in 20th century theory.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Yeah, all kinds of it kind of undermines the whole tradition. So getting to that undermining, what's different from a college student getting assistance from an LLM and Andy Warhol's factory in terms of final authorship? You know, like he would have the workers do the actual painting. So what they're saying, like, hey, this is my idea. It says exactly what I want to say, but I just outsource the labor.
Yeah, this is part and parcel of this whole logocentric tradition that we've been talking about. This idea that a piece of writing or an artwork is the product of a unique singular genius who therefore
Right.
takes his or her ideas and embodies them in some artwork or some written text that then communicates to us. That's a very modern notion. Um, Foucault, in particular, says that it is really a result of the Enlightenment and the rise of the individual, not only in French rationalism through Descartes, but also through the Protestant Reformation and the notion of personal individual faith, and also the development of intellectual property in English law that also happened during that period of time. And both he and Barth point out that this notion of the author as being the sole individual genius, not only is it part of the European modern tradition, but it has expanded globally, mainly due to religious conversion, colonialism, and other things like that. But when we look at other cultures before globalization and before colonial expansion, we see that there are traditions in which authorship doesn't have the same role to play, and that various artworks, various narratives, various ways of describing the world around us is shared by communities. And therefore, It's not a matter of individuals, it's a matter of groups of people working together to create the kinds of things, and that there is no sole individual genius, but there is what Brian Eno calls a scenus, that we're part of a scene, and that we emerge out of the things around us, remixing what we're surrounded by. And I think Warhol's factory is a really good way of mobilizing this in the sort of 60s and 70s, because what Warhol did is to sort of industrialize artistic production and distribute authority and authorship across the many hands of people who were engaged in helping him in the creation of the works of art. Now, of course, the art world has had to identify a singular author for the soup cans and everything else that came out of the factory, and they attributed it to the manager of it all, who was Andy Warhol. But Andy Warhol's hands did not create every single work of art that bears his name in the museum. And this is something that we think is rather postmodern, but it actually is pre-modern. If you look at the way in which the pre-modern artists worked in the Middle Ages, in particular in the early Renaissance, they worked in workshops. And so that a painting that bears the name of Raphael or some other famous artist oftentimes was a result of a master working with a lot of apprentices that were helping him or her create the artworks in much the same way that Warhol does with the factory. So I think what we're seeing with generative AI and large language models is the expansion of this concept at scale. We're just blowing it up to a massive level that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, we're just completely destroying our previous notions at a increasingly faster and faster rate. Just totally deconstructing that idea of the singular artist. So yeah, that goes into there's this notion of the outlier or the singular genius, but also the idea that Ferguson asserts that all creativity involves the process of copy, transform, combine. Can you maybe speak a little bit specifically to that process of copy, transform, and combine? You did hit
Yes,
on many of the parts of the question as far as
right. So Kirby Ferguson in his web
as far as
documentary,
with the singular
uh,
genius.
yeah, called "Everything Is a Remix," comes up with this sort of recipe of creativity, which basically is a remix way of redescribing creativity. And his point is that if we're looking for creativity that is sort of creating out of nothing, that's a myth. It's a myth that we created in the process of the Enlightenment in the modern period, and imbuing an individual genius as the source of the piece of writing, the artwork, the symphony, or whatever the case is. And if you look at the way that we organize art criticism and art history, it is really around geniuses. It's around Mozart. It's around people, who become famous for a piece
Newton,
of
Galileo.
that they create. And so we have these names: authors, artists, painters, composers, etc. But when you look at the way in which artistry actually happens, and when you talk to these individuals about how they create, they generally describe it as drawing from the culture around them and recombining and repurposing and reformulating various things that they've borrowed from other parts of their experiences. So, for example, you have somebody like Bartok, who did the Hungarian dances, symphonies, and other compositions like that. And how did he do that? He went to the people who, in the folk traditions, and he basically ripped off folk songs and then turned them into classical music. Now, that could be called theft, but it's actually borrowing. And we borrow all the time. We borrow from what came before and we remake it and reformulate it. And the idea is not that art happens as a kind of singular activity, but it is an ongoing dialogue with the world around you, with the things of nature, with the other artists that you surround yourself with the culture in which you grew up. And that Ferguson's point is simply we need to acknowledge this honestly. We need to say that all creativity has really been a kind of remix, and that something like hip hop is not an aberration, is not an anomaly, but rather sampling and reusing is part of what artists have always done.
Yeah, that made me think a little bit of like Elvis, where he took historically black music and repackaged it, and it appealed to a whole new crowd. but he was really ripping off, I guess, ripping off or borrowing elements from the black community. Can you tell me a little bit about the good old fashioned AI and the painting fool? How we can maybe distill genius to an algorithm? If is that possible?
Yeah, so this has been the task of what's called computational creativity. And you might think this is a rather new innovation of applying computers to creating art, but it's actually been going on for a long time, even before digital computers. During the sort of classical music period, there was a algorithmic composition game, basically. It was a dice game. And you would roll dice, and it would give you different notes, and you'd copy them down, and then you could roll dice again and copy them down, and you could actually compose a symphony by randomly rolling these objects and getting notes that you then put on your score and create an original piece of music. We've just automated this with digital computers, whether it be for painting, whether it be for composing music, whether it be for making video. We can do all these things now using various forms of computational creativity that are leveraging the power of the digital computer. And one of the earliest examples of this are the experiments undertaken by Simon Colton in England with something called the painting fool. And for him, the painting fool was an algorithm, or a set of algorithms actually, that wanted at some point in the future to be taken seriously as a creative artist. And he used very classic computing approaches, something called good old fashioned AI, which is really symbolic reasoning, where you write out step by step instructions of how to take something and transform it. So take input, transform it to output. And one of his most famous projects is what's called collage with intent, in which the painting fool would
Yeah.
search the internet for all kinds of images and then collage them together and then transform them through various image processing tools like you have in Photoshop and create a new artwork as a result of that. And it was just following these instructions that Colton had spelled out individually, one item after another.
Yeah, it's interesting the idea of a genius, but without any genius actually, any intention or thought. The painting fool. Onto a robots person thing. Can you tell me about the idea of robot rights, like in Virginia, a personal delivery device operating on a sidewalk or a crosswalk shall have the rights and responsibilities applicable as a person under the same circumstances? Or if you'd like to maybe enter in at a different point on that paper, that's fine
No,
too.
that's
But
I
I
think
thought
it's
that was interesting.
it's a good entry point because I think when you say the word or the two words together, robot rights, and someone hears you say that, the immediate association that we make is that, oh my God, you're saying that robots should have human rights. And it's because when we hear the word rights, we automatically, I think, default to human rights because that's mostly the kind of rights talk that non-legal people hear about. It's always about human rights abuses, human rights protections, and things like this. But I think we've got to parse it a little more carefully and recognize that rights, especially in law, are not necessarily something that blows up to the size of human rights. Rights, when you get right down to it, is the way in which we sort out conflict in social circumstances. So when there are two or more people involved in something, one person can have responsibilities to recognize the rights of another person. So that rights are just the things that have to be recognized in social interactions and transactions that we have on a daily basis. And we have rights either by nature, these are the big human rights like the right to life, free speech, the right to religion, these sorts of things. Those are things that we think we have by nature, by the fact of who we are and what we are. But there are also legal rights. And these are rights that are delivered and decided on by courts and legislatures. So right now, corporations are considered persons, and they have the same rights and responsibilities that many of us as natural persons have. Not because they're conscious, not because they're born with human rights, but because we need to fit them into our legal environment. And so the reason why corporations became persons is because we wanted to hold them responsible. We wanted to be able to sue them for wrongdoing. And in order to do that, they had to have standing in the law and therefore be considered a person and not just a thing. And so the rights that we give the corporations are bestowed upon them due to legal decision making and trying to fit corporations into our everyday social interactions and make our world a better world for us to live in. So you mentioned these robots that now in 12 states of the United States have the rights and responsibilities of pedestrians. Now that sounds like a really strange thing, but we got to figure out what's going on
It's like
here.
overkill.
Yeah, so we've got these little wheeled robots that are rolling around city streets now. We have them in Chicago. There's elsewhere in the country where these things exist. And the company that builds these robots were very worried at one point that when the robot is in a crosswalk, crossing the street, making a delivery of a pizza or a coffee to somebody, it might be a traffic accident. Like a car may blow through a stop sign or not obey a red light and hit the robot. And as a result, we'd have to figure out who's accountable for that accident. In other words, who's liable for the damages that are caused. So this company went to these various state legislatures and petitioned them to make laws protecting the robots when they are operating on the street. And the lawmakers basically do what lawmakers always do, is they looked at the current laws on the books and they said, well, we say nothing about robots in our current laws, but we do talk about pedestrians. And pedestrians can be in traffic too and get hit by cars. And we have certain protections for pedestrians. So why not just give robots the status of pedestrian when it's on the street, therefore giving to it the same rights and responsibilities that human pedestrians have when they are operating on the street and crossing on a crosswalk? So the letter of the law says the robot operating on the street shall have all the rights and responsibilities of a pedestrian. Now, this doesn't mean that robots have the same status as human beings. It doesn't mean that robots are persons. It just means that when the robot is in the crosswalk, it has the rights and responsibilities that we accord to pedestrians in the same circumstances. And this is the way in which I think the robot uprising is going to take place, right? In science fiction, it's about an invasion, and
Okay.
the robots, attack us and they take over this way. And that makes for good drama. But I think the way the robot invasion or the robot incursion takes place in real life is that over time, we extend various legal protections and recognitions to robots as a way of accommodating them to our very human world. So we use laws written for humans and apply them to robots in various very tightly controlled and contextualized situations. And this is a very good example of that.
Yeah, great. I have I'm in Philadelphia, so I've noticed those little wheeled delivery. We have the wheeled delivery robots go by. It's a very strange feeling. Like it feels like we're in the future. We're heading towards the future like rapidly when you start to see those. Now AI systems robots. I think you touched on it. Can be people. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I guess in the legal sense, unless you
Yeah.
feel like you already covered that, or more
No,
specifically towards that.
we started to talk a little bit about it, but we've got to, I think, tease out some of the
Okay.
details here. Um, so this word person that we have is important because we actually divide the world up into two kinds of categories. You're either a person, and
Person's
therefore
thing.
you're a subject of the law, or you're a thing, and therefore you're an object. And this person thing dichotomy is inherited from the Romans. It is given to us by a Roman jurist named Gaius, who in the year, I think, 300 AD, came up with this notion as a way of organizing sort of categories for legal practice. And it really has been adopted by most legal systems across the globe at this point. It is especially important in Western legal systems where person and thing are really the two categories by which we divide up entities for the purposes of legal transactions. So, one of the questions would be, well, why would we need to think about AI or robots as persons? And the reason we would need to think of them as persons isn't because they're necessarily conscious, isn't because they have feelings like we do as natural persons, but it's because we want them to play a certain role in our legal environment, and therefore we make them legal persons, like a corporation. So corporations are also artificial entities that we create that we invented and that we give the status of person to in order for them to fit smoothly into our current legal environment. It's not just corporations, it's churches, it's organizations, it's also ships and maritime law. So in the law of the sea, ships are considered persons. And we're doing this not because we think we're going to hurt their feelings or we have to, be respectful of their dignity. They don't have any of that. It's because we want them to be able to fit into our legal practices in a way that makes them a subject of law and not just an object. And so, one of the ways that people are addressing some of the questions arising from AI, especially with regards to responsibility, like if an AI creates an artwork, who owns the IP? Who owns the copyright to that? If a robot
That's a
makes a
great question.
decision, and like you have a robotic drone and it takes out a civilian target, who is responsible for that attack? Who is accountable if that's a war crime for the war crime? And so making these things persons is one way that we could possibly sort out some of these more thorny questions about distributed responsibility at this period of time where finding the person who is responsible for the outcome is rather complicated by the many hands problem.
Yes, would you be able to talk about the many hands problem?
So it's an idea that comes from Helen Nissenbaum, excuse me. So Helen Nissenbaum wrote a paper in the 90s on the many hands problem in these sort of technological assemblages. And her point was very simple that, going back to this authorship idea, we always thought that when something was created, there was one person who was responsible for it. We also think this when it comes to sort of different outcomes that could be harmful. That if an accident happens, there must be someone who's responsible for the accident. And that person then bears the responsibility for making good on damages and things like this. And so part of what the courts grapple with is trying to decide who's the responsible party, and then either giving them a fine or some sort of criminal indictment as a result of the outcomes of their decision making or their actions. So when you have very complex technological systems, like you have with AI, and let's just take large language models as an example. If a large language model produces some very problematic hate speech, like the algorithm at X did not too long ago when Grok declared to the world that it's Mecha Hitler, right? And it started spitting out some rather heinous hate speech. The question then becomes, well, okay, who's responsible for the hate speech? Who can we hold responsible for those bad outcomes? And when you ask the developers say, well, we didn't program this thing to do that. We just created a learning algorithm, trained it on a bunch of data, and it evolved this behavior based on interactions with users. So then, is it the user's fault? Well, the user is just prompting a large language model. And they can prompt it with all kinds of things, but the large language model isn't necessarily under their control. And then you say, okay, so maybe it's the training data because we've scraped the internet for all this stuff and the bias and the hate speech is accessible in the training data and it's just reproducing what's in the training data. So how do you track back through all these pieces of data to find the one or two persons who actually wrote the original content in the training data that then calibrated the parameters in the model to be able to do this? So as you can see, what happens is that responsibility gets disseminated throughout this network. And that means identifying who or what is responsible gets increasingly complex and difficult to decide. And that is a reality of the technology, but it doesn't satisfy the legal requirement and the moral requirement that we have for someone to ultimately be responsible for what went wrong.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not the one that has to figure that all out. That sounds very complex. Let's talk about the ideas of ethnocentrism, Christianity mixed with Greek philosophy and Roman law, and how maybe that tradition makes law or understanding some of these problems using philosophical tools difficult.
Yeah, so I think the person thing dichotomy is a really good example of this kind of inherited ethnocentrism. So this arises out of Roman culture, It is something that is very much adopted by the Western traditions that sort of grew out of the sort of Roman period and the Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. And it has, been applied to our legal systems in ways that are practical and that help us solve problems. But when you look globally, you find other cultures and other legal traditions didn't decide things this way. And I'll just give you two examples of two differences that I think are important. If we look at the way that indigenous cultures have divided up reality, they don't divide things up into persons and things. They have kinship relationships that span not only living things, but non living things, so that you can bear kinship responsibilities and interactions not only to other human beings, but to animals, to the things of nature, and to the artifacts that you create. And this creates a very different kind of spectrum of entities that are responsive to this kind of notion of shared kinship through the embeddedness that we have with these various others that are not necessarily human. Another good example is if you look at what evolves out of Japanese traditions, out of Shintoism and other Japanese philosophy. In Japan, there's this notion of inoche, which is this idea of life. And for us in the West, life seems to be something that is organic, belongs to you and I, maybe our pet dog, plants maybe, but it isn't something shared with robots and AI. They're not alive. In Japan, however, this concept of a noche is not just organic being. Things that are manufactured can have a noche because a noche is about the function or the role or the kind of mechanisms that embed something in the various interactions around it. And therefore, a robot can be seen as alive in a way that us Westerners would never recognize as such because our word life isn't elastic enough to expand to that kind of inclusion. And so when we start to look at how these ideas, these categories are inherited and what they mean for us, we can see that just because we are doing this and we've done it now for 2,000 years and it looks like the right way to do things, it necessarily isn't the only way to do things, and it might not be the right way to do things. There might be alternatives that open up some other opportunities for thinking about how we respond to others that are around us, not just other human beings, but other non-human beings like animals, the things of nature, and the artifacts with which we surround ourselves. And that we may gain some traction on making sense of the moral and legal challenges of AI and robots by thinking outside the boxes that we've inherited from these traditions that we thought were universal, but turn out to be very particular to one culture or one particular language, in fact.
Yes, there's sometimes you don't even notice that you're swimming in water until you get out. I mostly read about, from Western thinkers. And then when I read something like Eastern philosophy or other religions and laws, they really have some great ideas and perspectives that are just as valid. If we could move to a difference engine, a lot of people think AI understands language. Do you think that's true, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really important question in the face of these powerful new large language models like Claude, OpenAI's ChatGPT, and Google's Gemini. So I think the sort of user experiences, I type these prompts into the large language model and it replies to me. And it replies to me in ways that are very fluent, that are very confident, and in some senses, very persuasive. And that looks like conversational interaction. And we have to recognize that this is something that is old in the field of AI. Already with Alan Turing in 1950, with his paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Turing said, we don't know if a machine is intelligent or not. All we can do is use external behaviors that we take as signs of intelligence to decide whether something is, or to infer whether something is intelligent. So Turing's imitation game, or what we call the Turing test, is really a test of communication. It says, can the machine communicate with me in a way that is indistinguishable from the way that a human does? And if it can, then we can infer that it is intelligent. And that inference is based on something that is very old. This idea, if it talks, it thinks. And this goes back to what we talked about right at the beginning, that we see speech as a direct sign of thought. And for us, that has been very tightly connected for 2,000 plus years. Large language models are pulling this apart. They are able to separate or divorce thought from language. And so, what we get with AI, especially in the form of large language models, is language generation where there is no thought. There is this idea that if it thinks, it speaks, and if it speaks, it thinks. But now we have something where it just speaks. It doesn't necessarily think.
Yes.
What is the large language model doing? It's putting words together in probable sequences, sequences that it has learned from us. And so it can reproduce the probability of word sequences that look to us like fluent language use that must be a sign of thought. But the fact is, it's just statistical probability.
Yeah, as you say, it's just a stochastic parrot, if I said that right. Now, if AI doesn't actually understand, why does it feel like it does? Is that part of like the programming, the experience that ChatGPT developers were going for? Because it is very convincing. It'll
Yeah.
say like it's on your side, all sorts of uh, things to convince you that it's more than just machinery.
Yeah, it's not a problem with the program. It's not a problem with the developers. It's not a problem with the tech companies. It's a problem with us, the user, because we're the ones that infer intelligence behind the words. And we shouldn't be faulted
Oh,
for this. It's not a problem that we can just like get rid of easily because it's part of the way we think about language use. There's all kinds of things in our world that we encounter that don't use language. Animals, trees, cars, these are things. But there are other entities that use language, other persons. These are what we refer to as persons because they are like us and we assume they have intelligence, consciousness, emotions, things like this. But we infer it based on language. We infer it based on behavior using linguistic signs to speak about thought. So we've inherited this way of thinking about words and we apply it to these very powerful new tools. So it's not a fault that can be easily erased. It's something we have to unlearn. It's something we are being challenged with to sort of think outside the box of our normal way of making sense of who uses language and what does not. And it used to be the case that if it was a computer, it didn't use language, it was a thing, and now it's starting to look more like a person, at least in terms of the way that it is engaging us in very conversational, very convincing, and very confident kinds of exchanges of language.
now, does AI show that meaning was never stable to begin with? Can you maybe talk a little bit about Derrida and the concept of difference?
Yeah. So Derrida has this idea of difference, which just says that this idea that we have in our mind that when I say a word, it refers to a thing. So when I say dog, that means this animal that we call dog. But the fact is that dog and the animal that it points to have no natural connection. That's arbitrary. This is something that Ferdinand de Saussure pointed out in his work in structural linguistics. So what I say is a dog, a German will say is Hund, or a Pole will say is Pies. Those words also apply to that thing that I call dog in English. And so Derrida's point following Saussure is that if language is arbitrary, and words don't have any natural connection to the things we think they point to, it means that, again, this coming from Saussure, the way that we make sense of words is not by its way of relating to things in the world, but the way it relates to and differs from other words in the system of language. So, a good example is the dictionary. When I look up the word dog in a dictionary, I don't get a dog. What I get are other words. A mammal with four legs that is in the species canine, right? So when you look up a word, all you get are more words. And as you move through the dictionary, looking up word after word after word, you never leave the enclosure of language. You never get outside language to what semioticians call the transcendental signified. And so Derrida's way of expressing this rather cleverly is to say there's nothing outside the text, which isn't an anti-realist statement. It just says when we're talking about language and we're trying to make sense of signs and semiology, signs refer to other signs. And as a result of all this, it means that meaning is not out there in the world for us to, discover by its natural connection to a word. Meaning arises in the way that we use language and the way language differs from each other, each word differs from each other, but also defers to other words, like in a dictionary. And so Derrida's word difference is an attempt to name this differentiation and deferral that happens in the material of language itself. And that meaning arises out of that, not out of this indexical relationship to reality that we assume language does.
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. It's more about the difference between language itself and not pointing to the actual object at all. Now, AI and remix, is AI creativity actually different from how humans create? Could you tell a little bit about how AIs create?
Right. So I think there are important things to be gained by the analogy to remix when we talk about generative AI. Like remix, generative AI is working with source material, in this case, training data. It is creating new things out of old things by reconfiguring what is in the training data. And as a result, a lot of the questions that we raise about remix, about authorship, about originality, about individual genius, all those things are in play also for generative AI. And so I think Remix gives us a powerful analogy when we're starting to talk about the way in which generative AI challenges existing sort of modernist notions of artistry, creativity, and originality. But I also think there's differences that are important. One of the differences is when you're talking about Remix, you can generally find in the remix the fragments of the samples that are combined to create the remix content. So when Kirby Ferguson is talking about all things are remix, he's saying that you can always understand creativity as remix, but you can also find and track back through the remix some connection to the source material. And so one of the joys of remix as an art form
Um,
is that you're able to see in the sample the whole from which it was taken. So when DJ Danger Mouse layered the lyrics of Jay-Z on top of the music from the Beatles, you could always tell what Beatles song it was. Because in the sample that he used, you could hear the original and you could track it back to the source, right? In generative AI, it's very difficult to see the sample in the output of a generative AI system because it is not working with samples in the same way that Remix is, but it's working with training data and developing new material based on what it has learned in the training instances. We can rarely see the samples or the training instances in the generative AI output. And so two artists, Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, have tried to insist that we don't talk about samples anymore when talking about generative AI. We talk about what's called spawning. And spawning for them is we spawn new instances of things out of the training data as opposed to sampling and simply remixing. So that, I think, is one real big difference in generative AI. A second big difference that I think is equally important is that Remix began as a sort of street level intervention in commodity culture by kids basically taking turntables and vinyl records and making their own music in the Bronx. And that's how we get hip hop. So it's something that bubbles up from, sort of some of the poorest communities in the US who are using commodity culture against itself, right? They're repurposing the records that are sold as consumer objects and creating new music out of that and inventing this new art form called hip hop. In generative AI, these things are owned by multinational corporations. These are not kids out of poverty. These are very well, situated and very
Yeah, the New York Yankees,
funded,
big time.
kind of
Yeah.
multinationals. And as a result, even though the outcome might be very similar to what we see with hip hop and other remix practices, the uh, idea that this is similar to that has got to be at least be differentiated in terms of political economy, because these are now big multinational corporations that control the means of production with regards to generative AI. And so, what was innovated as a revolutionary art form with hip hop has now been sort of reconstituted as a multinational corporation has taken over the same kinds of capabilities, but now made them commercial products and impose them through the various platforms that are available.
Now, if all creativity is remix, what is originality, or does that even exist in any meaningful way anymore, or at all?
So I think, it doesn't mean originality goes away. I think it just means that we have to be more honest about how we characterize what originality is. So this notion that originality is creation out of nothing, that's actually a theological idea that comes from Judeo-Christian scripture, and this notion that God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing. But that's a myth. That's something that we invented to explain how we got here. We've extended it to human creators, saying that they are the image of God and they create in the image of this creation out of nothing, or ex nihilo, as is said in Latin. This has been something that has been very persuasive. It helps us validate artistry. It helps us create value for various kinds of artworks that are created by particularly talented and creative individuals or groups of individuals. But it is beholden to this very old notion of creating out of nothing. And when you talk to artists in particular and you find out how it is they do their work, it turns out that everyone is engaged in Ferguson's remix practices of appropriating what is around them, recombining it, transforming it, and creating something new out of something old. And that good artists take from the things around them and remake them for their time in ways that create this thing we call originality. So I think it's not a matter of tossing out the idea of originality, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it is actually redefining creativity and originality in ways that are more attentively looking at what it is we actually do when we as human beings create things.
Okay, great. And we're heading towards the end of the interview, so I wanted to ask you maybe some fun questions. Maybe you might be able to venture, uh, maybe like apocalypse scenarios. Which are maybe kind of most likely? Have you thought about it at all? Is there anything that especially keeps you up at night? Or like what movie might the near future most resemble? Are we talking 20, 30 years from now, or even
Yeah.
100 years from now?
So I
Yeah.
think when we look at, let's start with movies. When you look at science fiction movies, the sort of apocalypse version, the sort of robot apocalypse or the AI apocalypse as we have it in our various science fictions are always these kinds of, big humankind versus the robots in some struggle for domination. We see it already in the piece of fiction that gave us the word robot, Karl Čapek's RUR from 1920, a play by this Czech playwright where he invents the word robot out of the Czech word for slave or forced servitude, robota. And that is already the first science fiction story with robots, and it's a story about an uprising. And you look at every single thing since then. You look at Metropolis, you look at the HAL 9000 computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you look at the Terminator series, you look at the Matrix series, you look at the two films based on Philip K. Dick's novella, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, the Blade Runners. You look at all these films, and they're always these apocalyptic visions of the robot uprising. For me, the film that I think gets the robot uprising or the AI uprising more correct is the film Her, in which there's no laser guns, there's no battles, nobody dies, there's no big struggle that's, big and dramatic. It's just a guy falling in love with his operating system. That is where the robot uprising
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, I've seen that.
It's this slow incursion where we roll the machines into everyday human activities, whether it be um, companionship, whether it be therapy, whether it be medicine, whether it be for romantic partners. And as these machines take on these social roles, they are transforming our social environment in ways that we might not be attentive to. And so, if there's something that keeps me up at night, it's trying to keep track of these very slow, very incremental expansions of our social world in ways that we are not keeping track of because they don't look big. They don't look dramatic. They don't look like science fiction, but they are the sort of mundane facts of everyday life that we are accommodating ourselves to the machines, and the machines are accommodating themselves to us, and we are changing our legal structures, our moral structures, and our social structures in real time to accommodate these new entities and build them into our social future. And that for me is where we got to keep our eyes on the prize.
Yeah, that'll be especially tough to defend against. It's just a slow kind of changing our ways. It's never something that humans that typically are able to evolve against. So I hope we change our ways because that's going to be tough. I have two more questions. I'm sure students would like to know what's the absolute least they could do when using a chatbot to be able to get credit for their essays.
Yeah. So I say, so I'll tell you what I tell my students. Um, Obviously, these tools are there. They're going to be there after you graduate. They are going to transform your work environment and they are transforming your classroom environment. So, prohibition is completely off the table. When we prohibit something and say, thou shalt not use ChatGPT to do anything in your college career, I think that's naive. It's naive because you're going to use it anyways, but it's also naive because it teaches students nothing. And we want them to learn how to live with these things responsibly and effectively. And in order to do that, we have to engage them in the process. We have to model for them the right kinds of activities and uses that we want to see. And we have to give them opportunity to experiment and discover, because that's what education is all about. So if you're going to use ChatGPT to help you write an essay, I would say there's a couple of ways in which you can use it effectively. One way is it's a good method for getting past the blank page anxiety. Usually, when you ask students to write, the first thing that they encounter is that blank screen in Word where they have to put down the
Yeah,
first couple of words to begin
where to
writing.
start?
And that creates a lot of anxiety for writers, not only students, but professional writers. One way to use the chatbot effectively is to say to the chatbot, I have to write an essay about robots and current law and what that might look like 10 years from now. And say, what would an opening paragraph maybe look like for developing that kind of essay? Don't ask it to write the whole essay. Just ask it to give you a little bit of teaser for it. And then that helps you get over the sort of hurdle of the blank page. Because now the algorithm has given you something you can build off of. And then building off of it makes it your own and not the algorithms. Another way to use ChatGPT, I think, in a way that is responsible and attentive to current practice is when you find yourself really stuck. You're trying to explain something and you just can't put the words together in the right order to explain it. Take the very sketchy version you have, put it in the algorithm and say, hey, I'm writing this thing. I got to explain this, and all I have right now are these sort of sketchy notes. Can you help sew this together into sentences that are coherent and make sense? And because these large language models are really good at word sequences, and if you give them the ideas, they will help put the
Especially
words together in a way that is persuasive, compelling, and engaging that maybe is beyond your particular capabilities at that moment. In the process of doing that, you're not just offloading your cognitive load to the algorithm. You're actually learning something because you're seeing how another writer, in this case, the algorithm, takes your ideas and formulates it into sentences. And so not only are you getting that help in putting the words together, but then when you see the words put together and you sort of edit them, you are learning something in the process about writing that next time will inform what you do when you're sitting down to write. The final thing I would say about working with algorithms in your writing process is that never ever turn in something that is wholly AI generated without checking every single sentence and every single word for accuracy. The algorithms are good at word sequences. They don't know facts.
those make
So
mistakes.
yeah, and they make mistakes. And these mistakes will embarrass you because they will stand out, and your instructor will look at the essay that you've
So
given them
obvious.
and will say, "This is actually very lazy work." Give you an F and send you out the door. If you take the time to fact check, edit, and double check everything that is part of your interaction with the AI in generating your paper, not only are you doing the important work that needs to be done in learning the material, but you are making sure that what word sequences you may have obtained from the algorithm actually do relate to facts and ideas that are able to be verified. And the most important one is obviously any citations. The algorithm does not do citations, and it doesn't do it very well, even if you ask it to. That's really your job. And one way to avoid your paper being flagged for AI generation is that the AI never gives page numbers. So if the AI says that this is something you can find in Marshall McLuhan and gives you a book that Marshall McLuhan wrote, go to the book, find out where in the book Marshall McLuhan said this particular thing, verify that it's there, fact check it, but then you get the page numbers too.
That's great advice. It's yeah, it's really if AI can definitely make mistakes and you can get in trouble or worse. It kind of sounds a little bit like dating. Like, I know your students are going to date, but just be safe. Now, my final question is I plan on going to grad school and kind of like death of philosophy. Like, philosophy really relies on distinguishing themselves as being great writers. There's the whole gatekeeping question. Does generative AI, serve as an existential threat to philosophy, in your opinion? Because I used to play competitive chess, and I thought when chess computers came out that it might be an existential threat to chess. Chess is done, but actually it got better
Yeah.
for a while, and now kind of traditional chess is running out, and they're going to go to chess 960 at some point. So it did actually improve it at to more than I thought it would for some time. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about existential threat to philosophy as a profession
Yeah, so the answer
from
to that question,
AI, if that's something that you worry about.
yeah, the answer to that question, I think all depends on what kind of philosophy you study and what kind of philosopher you are. So if you're beholden to very traditional notions of language and mind and other kinds of concepts that have been inherited within the tradition, and you want to work only within those limited boundaries, I think AI is going to be a big frustration, if not a existential threat and crisis, because it doesn't play by those rules. If you are willing to think outside the box and willing to challenge accepted ideas, concepts, and practices that have grown up in the last 2,000 years of philosophy, I think AI is an incredible opportunity. And knowing that difference, I think, is really important for anyone contemplating studying philosophy at this time. I think there's a lot philosophy can bring to our understanding of AI, but it has to be brought not by saying all the stuff that the AI is doing is wrong. We should go back in time to the way things were good in the good old days and look at how this can be stopped. I think we have to look at this as an opportunity that says this is going to change philosophy. It's going to change the way we think about philosophy. It's going to change the standards and practices in philosophy. And we should look at AI as a philosophical tool for rethinking the tradition and opening up our thinking to other ways of proceeding, other ways of asking questions, and other ways of engaging with some of the older questions that have defined the discipline. And that, I think, gives philosophy a real good position in the coming decades as we grapple with a lot of the big questions regarding artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I think it should help. The only thing I might be concerned about is like the gatekeeping, whereas to actually being able to write and put it together is it could be one of the main skills. But I did want to say, thank you so much. This was really above my expectations. What you delivered, definitely over delivered. And I'm interviewing Dr. Sullins next week,
Oh,
uh,
good.
and so I plan to be improved as an interviewer by then. Now, do you think do you have any insights or anything I should maybe ask him? I have to go through more of his papers, but is there any, or if you could ask him one thing?
So, two things John has been working on that I think are really interesting. He's been working on this notion of artificial phronesis, which in Aristotle, phronesis is this notion of practical wisdom.
Yes,
And talking
yes.
about ways in which you could maybe automate phronesis, or whether automation of phronesis or computation of phronesis is possible or not. And I think a lot of his earlier research is on that question. More recently, I think he's been doing a lot of work in the defense area, and uh, collaborating with people in not only the defense industry, but also in the Department of Defense on AI and robots in the area of defense. And so I think right now, as we see the increased use of drones, not only in the war between Ukraine and Russia, but also in the current Iranian conflict, we're seeing drones play a greater and greater role in warfare. And a lot of these drones are either autonomous or semi-autonomous. And I think that raises a lot of really interesting questions about responsibility and about accountability in drone warfare.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely fascinating. I look forward to it, and I plan to improve my interview skills and have lots of great questions for him by that time. But I just wanted to thank you so much. I plan on reading more of your papers, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. It was really fun.